Ahead.
You violated Article 9, Section C.
I just moved in 3 days ago.
You'll be fined if it's not gone.
I've handled worse than this.
Frank Miller's retirement cost him $412,000, and in return, he got fined $150 for a stain he didn't make. The irony didn't hit until day 3, when a cream-colored envelope slid through his mail slot like a summons from a higher power, one that cared more about concrete than character. He'd traded the thunder of jet engines for a neighborhood so quiet it felt sterilized. Liberty Hills was supposed to be peace. Instead, it was paperwork. At 68, Frank had survived decades of Air Force bureaucracy, hostile airfields, and even the slow grief of widowhood. He wasn't expecting to go to war again, especially not over a dark smudge on his driveway. But Liberty Hills had its own kind of battlefield, and the Homeowners Association didn't know they just picked a fight with a man who once taught pilots how to land blind. This wasn't just about oil. This was about principle. And in Liberty Hills, principles cost extra. His gaze fell upon the pegboard, a blank canvas. Soon it would be a testament to order. Hammers aligned by weight, wrenches by size, screwdrivers by type and length. A place for everything and everything in its place. It was the creed of an Air Force Chief Master Sergeant, a philosophy that had kept men alive and multi-million-dollar aircraft in the sky. Order wasn't just about tidiness, it was about control, about knowing you could lay your hands on the exact tool you needed in the dark. It was the opposite of chaos. It was sanity. He walked out onto the driveway, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the neatly manicured lawns of his neighbors. The concrete under his worn work boots was a mosaic of gray tones, interrupted by one significant imperfection, a dark, sprawling stain near the garage door. It looked like a ghost map of some forgotten continent. The oil stain had been noted in the home inspection report, a relic left by the previous owner, a car enthusiast who apparently hadn't shared Frank's reverence for cleanliness. Frank ran his toe over its edge. It was old, deep set, a part of the property's history. He made a mental note. Project number 1. Find the right degreaser. A little trisodium phosphate, maybe a poultice. It was a problem, and problems were simply puzzles waiting for a solution. A friendly wave came from across the street. A woman with a sun hat and a trowel in her hand was tending to a riot of pink and red roses that bordered her property. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she called out, her voice clear and bright. "I'm Jenna Davis." "Frank Miller," he replied, giving a short, neighborly nod. "Good to be here. If you need anything, just give a holler, or, she chuckled, a polite knock. We're not much for hollering around here." Frank managed a small smile. She seemed nice. Everyone seemed nice. The houses were perfect, the lawns were perfect, the people were perfectly pleasant. It was exactly the kind of orderly world he'd been looking for, a place to finally unpack not just his boxes, but the weight he'd been carrying. He spent the rest of the day methodically breaking down cardboard, arranging his kitchen with military precision, and, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, he ceremoniously mounted the bracket for his American flag next to the front door. The flag itself would wait for morning. It deserved to be raised in the light. 3 days later, the first shot was fired. It didn't come with a bang, but with the soft whisper of paper sliding through his mail slot. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope, distinguished from the junk mail by its heavy bond paper and an embossed logo, a stylized eagle perched atop a perfect gabled roof. Liberty Hills Homeowners Association. Frank slid it open with his thumb, expecting a welcome packet, maybe a schedule for trash pickup. Instead, his eyes fell on a single sheet of paper, as cold and impersonal as a technical manual. Official notice of violation to homeowner, 42 Poplar Lane, from the Liberty Hills Architectural Control Committee. Date, July 11, 2025. Violation, unapproved chemical coil stain on driveway surface. Reference, Liberty Hills Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, Article 9, Section C. Action required, immediate remediation of the stain and a penalty of $150 payable to the Liberty Hills HOA within 14 days to avoid further action. Frank read it twice, then a third time. A slow burn started in his gut. This wasn't a welcome. It was an accusation. He looked from the letter with its sterile, unforgiving font out the front window to the offending stain. His stain, apparently. He had owned the property for less than a week. He walked back to the kitchen where a neat stack of documents sat on the counter. He pulled out the thickest one, the home inspection report. He flipped through the pages, past photos of furnaces and wiring, until he found the section on the exterior. There it was, in black and white, accompanied by a clear photograph. Note, pre-existing oil stain of a significant size located on driveway concrete near garage entrance. See photo 28B. A humorless chuckle escaped his lips. So, the crime had been documented before he even signed the deed. This was a mistake, a simple bureaucratic screw-up. He'd handled worse. He'd dealt with pilots who thought they knew more about engine torque than he did, with supply sergeants who couldn't find a cotter pin in a warehouse full of them. This was just another system with a faulty part. He found the contact number on the letterhead. Carol Petty, HOA President. He dialed, a sense of calm logic settling over him. State the facts, present the evidence. The problem will be resolved. That's how order worked. A crisp, businesslike voice answered on the third ring. Carol Petty. Yes, hello. This is Frank Miller at 42 Poplar Lane. I'm calling about a violation notice I received today. Mr. Miller, the new owner, yes? There was no warmth in her tone, just an impatient efficiency. That's right. It's regarding an oil stain on the driveway. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The stain was here when I bought the house. It's even noted in my official inspection report. He waited for the expected, "Oh, I see. My apologies. I'll clear that right up." Instead, there was a beat of silence, followed by a sigh, as if he were a particularly dense child. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice laced with a patronizing patience, "the covenants are very clear. As the current homeowner, you are responsible for the property's condition. The origin of the stain is, I'm afraid, irrelevant." Frank's knuckles whitened around the phone. He felt the calm, logical world he so carefully constructed begin to tilt. "With all due respect, ma'am, that doesn't seem reasonable. How can I be held responsible for something the previous owner did?" "It's not about being reasonable, Mr. Miller. It's about upholding the standards that keep Liberty Hills a desirable community for everyone. The rule is the rule. The rule is the rule." The phrase hung in the air, a steel door slamming shut. It was a phrase he detested. In the Air Force, you followed orders because they were part of a larger logical system designed for success and survival. You understood the why. This wasn't an order. It was a dead end. This wasn't about community standards. This was about blind obedience. And Frank Miller had spent a lifetime refusing to be blind. "I see," he said, his own voice now dangerously quiet. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Petty." He hung up the phone, the silence of the house no longer feeling peaceful. It felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. He looked at the letter again, then at his neat kitchen, at the unpacked boxes, at the empty bracket waiting for his flag. He had come here for sanctuary, but it seemed he had stumbled into a different kind of war. A petty war, a quiet war, but a war nonetheless. And there, on the concrete outside, was his battlefield. For a long moment after the call ended, Frank stood motionless in his kitchen. The quiet of the house had returned, but its character had changed again. It was no longer the sound of peace, nor the charged silence of an impending storm. It was the quiet of a chessboard after the opening move, the pieces set, the lines of attack and defense still theoretical but shimmering with potential. His mind, conditioned by decades of troubleshooting complex systems, began to break down the problem. Input: unreasonable fine for a pre-existing condition. Obstacle: an immovable bureaucrat, Carol Petty. Stated logic: the rule is the rule. Desired outcome: rescind fine, restore justice. The flaw in her logic was glaring. A rule without reason is just tyranny in miniature. He'd seen it before in the service. Officers fresh out of school who clung to the manual without understanding the mission, endangering their crews through sheer inflexibility. They were the ones who got people hurt. Carol Petty wasn't commanding a squadron, but she was commanding a community, and her rigid adherence to the letter of the law while ignoring its spirit was a malfunction in the system. Frank wouldn't be defeated by a malfunction. He would diagnose it, isolate it, and fix it. His first step was to escalate, but to do so within the established framework. He wouldn't lower himself to her level of petty stubbornness. He would be professional. He sat at the small desk in his spare bedroom, the wood still smelling of the furniture polish he'd applied a few days prior. He drafted a formal letter addressed not just to Carol, but to the entire HOA board of directors. His language was precise, respectful, and devoid of emotion. He stated the facts of his purchase. He cited the inspection report. He attached a high-quality photocopy of the relevant page, using a yellow highlighter to frame the exculpatory sentence. He respectfully requested they review the evidence and reconsider the Architectural Control Committee's decision. He concluded by stating his belief that a simple administrative error had occurred and that he looked forward to its amicable resolution. Before sealing the envelope, he made a copy for himself. He opened a drawer and pulled out a fresh manila folder. With a black permanent marker, he wrote HOA on the tab in neat block letters. The letter and its copy went inside. It was the first entry in what he instinctively knew would become a thicker file. He dropped the letter in the community mailbox, the metal door clanging shut with a satisfying finality. The ball was in their court. 4 days passed. Frank occupied himself with the small joys of setting up his new life. He unpacked his books, arranging them by author. He assembled a new gas grill on the back patio. He even took a crack at the stain itself, scrubbing a small test patch with a wire brush and a powerful degreaser he'd once used to clean hydraulic fluid off a hangar floor. The stain, ancient and defiant, barely faded. It held its ground like a hardened infantry unit dug into a hillside. On the 5th day, another cream-colored envelope appeared. The board's reply was even colder than the first notice. It was a single paragraph stating that his appeal had been reviewed and denied. It reiterated, almost verbatim, Carol's assertion about the current homeowner's absolute responsibility. The letter concluded with a chillingly cheerful sentence. Please be advised that as the initial 14-day grace period has expired, a late fee of 50 has been assessed. Your new balance is 200. Frank stared at the words. Your new balance is $200. It wasn't about the money. He could pay it and be done. But it was the principle, a concept as solid and real to him as the steel in an engine turbine. Paying the fine would be an admission of guilt he did not possess. It would be validating their broken logic. It would be surrender. And Chief Master Sergeant Frank Miller did not surrender. Logic and reason, delivered by mail, had failed. It was time for a face-to-face. He needed to look these people in the eye, or at least look her in the eye. He caught Jenna across the street the next morning, deadheading her roses with a pair of small, precise snips. Jenna, a quick question for you, he started. Shoot, she said, smiling, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. The HOA president, Carol Petty. Does she have office hours? A place I could speak with her directly? Jenna's smile tightened just a fraction, a subtle shift he wouldn't have missed on a pre-flight inspection. Oh, Carol doesn't really do office hours. She sort of presides. Your best bet is the community rose garden by the front gate. She's there most afternoons around 3, inspecting things. Inspecting is the word she uses anyway. That afternoon, at 3 o'clock sharp, Frank found her there. The rose garden was immaculate, a riot of color and fragrance that seemed almost unnaturally perfect. Carol Petty stood in the middle of it, wearing khaki trousers, a crisp white polo shirt, and leather gardening gloves. She was snipping a yellowed leaf from a rose bush with the focused intensity of a surgeon. Mrs. Petty? Frank said, keeping his voice even. She turned, her expression unreadable. Mr. Miller, I believe our correspondence is concluded. I don't, Frank said simply. I'm here to appeal to your common sense. I have provided proof that I did not create the issue for which I am being fined. I'm asking you, person to person, to do the right thing and waive the penalty. She stripped a thorn from a stem with a single, expert motion. The right thing, Mr. Miller, is to uphold the value and beauty of this community, and that is achieved by the uniform and impartial application of the rules we all agreed to live by when we bought our homes. If I make an exception for you, where does it end? Unmowed lawns? Peeling paint? A boat parked on the grass? Her argument was a textbook example of a slippery slope fallacy, and he was about to tell her so when she continued, her voice taking on the tone of a weary monarch. I have volunteered for this position for 5 years. It's a thankless job. I pour my time and energy into protecting your investment, and all I ask in return is compliance. Your driveway is a blight. It is your responsibility. The decision is final. She turned her back to him, physically dismissing him as if he were a nettlesome fly, and went back to her roses. The insult was profound. It wasn't just the refusal, It was the condescension, the utter disregard for his reasoned argument, the implication that he, a man who had managed hundreds of personnel and billions in assets, was a threat to the neighborhood's decorum. He stood there for a moment, the scent of roses thick in the air, a hot wave of anger washing over him, an anger he hadn't felt in years. He turned and walked away, his stride measured and firm. The fight had changed. It was no longer a matter of correcting a clerical error. He now understood the system's malfunction had a name, and it was Carol Petty. Logic was a tool she did not recognize. Evidence was an inconvenience she dismissed. This was about power. Her power. He walked back to his house, past the perfect lawns and the quiet, orderly facades. But he saw it all differently now. He saw the invisible lines of control, the petty fears that allowed a woman like Carol to reign. He reached his garage and pulled the heavy door shut, enclosing himself in his sanctuary of order and reason. The smell of oil and wood and steel filled his lungs. He looked at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of a life spent solving problems. Real problems. This was just one more. He pulled the HOA folder from his desk and laid it on his workbench, right between a set of torque wrenches and a schematic for a small engine. The objective was no longer to fix the stain. The objective was to fix the system. And to do that, he needed a new strategy. He needed better intelligence. He needed to understand the machine before he could take it apart. The garage had officially become Frank's command center. The air, thick with the comforting smells of his past life, now seemed charged with a new purpose. Under the focused beam of his workbench lamp, the HOA folder lay open. It was a pathetic file so far, containing only his own polite, rejected letter and the HOA's cold dismissals. It was a record of failed diplomacy. Now it was time for intelligence gathering. He drew a clean sheet of paper from a ream he kept for sketching out project designs. At the top, he wrote, Operation Petty Tyrant. A grim smile touched his lips. Giving the mission a name made it feel more tangible. Below, he drew 2 columns, What I Know and What I Need to Know. The No column was short. Carol Petty is unreasonable and operates on a rules for rules' sake basis. The board backs her decisions without question. Verbal and written appeals to logic are ineffective. The Need to Know column was much longer. What are the exact, unabridged rules? Need full CC&Rs document. Where does the money go? Need HOA budget and financial statements. Is there a history of this? Need intel from other residents. What is Carol Petty's weakness? He knew from his time in the service that you don't fight an entrenched enemy head-on without reconnaissance, and for that, he needed a local guide. He needed an ally. His thoughts immediately went to Jenna Davis and her knowing, sympathetic eyes. But you don't just ask a stranger to join your covert operation. You build rapport. You show you're trustworthy. The next morning, the smell of cinnamon and baked oats filled Frank's kitchen. He was baking Martha's oatmeal raisin cookies. Following her recipe, written in her familiar, looping cursive on a grease-stained index card, was a small act of devotion. Each measurement, each stir of the spoon brought her memory vividly to life. For a moment, he wasn't a retired sergeant on a mission. He was just a husband, making something his wife loved. He packed a dozen of the warm, fragrant cookies onto a plate and walked across the street. Jenna was watering her hydrangeas, a brilliant burst of blue against the dark green leaves. She looked up and smiled as he approached. "Don't tell me you're surrendering," she said, her tone teasing. "Never," Frank replied, holding out the plate. "This is a diplomatic envoy, my wife Martha's recipe." Jenna's expression softened. "That's very kind of you, Frank. They smell heavenly." She took a cookie, biting into it with a small sound of appreciation. Oh my, she was a talented baker. "She was," Frank said quietly. After a moment, he got to the point. "Jenna, you mentioned Carol Petty has been running things for a while. My run-in with her? Is that normal?" Jenna took another bite of cookie and leaned against her porch railing, her gaze sweeping over the peaceful street. "Normal for Carol?" "Yes, she once fined the Henderson family 2 houses down because their son's portable basketball hoop was visible from the street for more than 24 hours. Fined old Mr. Gable for having a garden gnome she deemed aesthetically inappropriate. She runs this place like her own private kingdom. Most people just pay the fine to make her go away. It's easier?" "It's not easier," Frank countered. "It just emboldens her." A spark of admiration lit Jenna's eyes. "You're the first person in a long time who said that out loud. If you're serious about fighting this, Frank, you need the documents. The CC&Rs, the budget, the meeting minutes. According to Article 3, Section D of the bylaws, every homeowner has the right to inspect them upon written request." "How do you know that?" "My husband was a paralegal. When we first moved in, we read the whole blasted thing cover to cover. It's as boring as watching paint dry. But it's the rule book, Carol's rule book. You have to use it against her." Then she leaned in conspiratorially. "And you need to join the Liberty Hills Uncensored Facebook group. It's private. The official HOA page is just sunshine and propaganda. But the uncensored one, that's where the real stories are." That night, armed with a new sense of purpose, Frank sent a certified letter to the HOA's management company, formally requesting copies of the last 2 years of financial statements, meeting minutes, and the complete current CC&Rs, citing Article 3, Section D. The certified letter was key. It created a legal paper trail. They couldn't claim they never received it. While he waited, he ventured into the digital wilderness of the Facebook group. Jenna had approved his request to join within minutes. It was like lifting a rock on the perfect lawn of Liberty Hills and seeing all the squirming life beneath. There were years of complaints, rants, and warnings. He saw posts about the basketball hoop, the garden gnome, and a dozen other petty infractions. He scrolled for hours, his coffee growing cold beside him, meticulously taking notes in his folder. And then he saw it, a name mentioned first in a post from a year ago. "Got a nasty letter about some algae on my north-facing siding. Carol helpfully suggested I call a company called Clean Slate Power Washing. Their quote was astronomical. Got it done for half the price with someone else, but she made me submit photos to prove it was up to her standard." Frank's fingers froze on the mouse. Clean Slate. He used the group's search function. The name appeared again and again. A post about driveway sealing, another about gutter cleaning. In every case, the story was the same. A violation notice from Carol, a strong recommendation for an overpriced company named Clean Slate, and trouble for anyone who dared to use a competitor. This wasn't just a pattern, it was a procedure. It was an operational directive. A week later, a thick manila envelope arrived. His documents. That evening, the garage was his sanctuary turned war room. He spread the papers across the vast, clean surface of his workbench. The CC&Rs were dense, filled with legalese. The meeting minutes were sterile and formal, but the budget was a treasure map. He slowly went through the expense reports, line by line, his finger tracing the columns of numbers. Landscaping, pool maintenance, insurance, and then a recurring entry under the Architectural Control Committee's discretionary fund, mandated property remediation. The payments were frequent and varied in amount, and the vendor for nearly 80% of them was the same, Clean Slate Services, LLC. Frank leaned back, the wooden stool creaking under his weight. He cross-referenced the dates of the payments with the meeting minutes. A payment to Clean Slate in May corresponded with a minute entry about resolving the siding issue at Lot 14. A payment in August matched the driveway ceiling non-compliance at Lot 22. The pieces were clicking into place with the cold, hard certainty of a socket wrench locking onto a bolt. This wasn't just a power trip. This wasn't just about a love of rules. This smelled like something else entirely. It smelled like money. He stared at the name on the page, circling it with his black marker until the ink bled slightly into the paper. Clean Slate Services, LLC. His hypothesis was forming, solid and heavy. The malfunction in the system wasn't just a faulty component named Carol Petty, it was a corrupted system. And his next mission was clear. He had to follow the money. He had to find out exactly who was behind Clean Slate. The name pulsed on the page under the stark light of Frank's workbench lamp. Clean Slate Services, LLC. It felt less like a company name and more like a declaration of intent, a promise to wipe away not just dirt, but money from the residents of Liberty Hills. Frank pushed away from the bench, the legs of the stool scraping against the smooth concrete floor. The hunt was on. He left the garage and went to his small office, the glow of the computer monitor casting a pale blue light in the dark room. In his previous life, finding information on a faulty part meant digging through dense technical orders, cross-referencing serial numbers against recall lists. Now, his primary tool was a search engine. The world had changed, but the principles of investigation remained the same. Follow the trail, trust the data, and assume nothing. He navigated to his state's Secretary of State website, the official digital archive of every business entity registered within its borders. He found the business search portal and typed the name into the box. Clean Slate Services, LLC. He hit Enter. A single result appeared. His pulse quickened. He clicked the link, and a page of public information loaded. Company status, active, date of formation, 4.5 years ago, roughly 6 months after Carol Petty was first elected HOA president. Frank's eyebrows shot up. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence. He scrolled down, his eyes scanning for the prize, the name of the registered agent and the managing members. He found the link to the original formation documents, a scanned PDF of the official filing. He clicked it open. The quality was grainy, the typewritten text slightly askew, but the information was clear. And there it was, managing member, Robert Petty. The name hit Frank with the force of a physical blow. Petty, it couldn't be. He quickly opened a new tab and searched the public property records for Liberty Hills. He found Carol Petty's address, 18 Primrose Path. He switched back to the LLC filing. The address listed for Robert Petty, managing member of Clean Slate Services, was 18 Primrose Path. It was her husband. Frank leaned back in his chair, a slow breath escaping his lips. It was a perfect closed loop of corruption, a racket so simple and yet so brazen it was almost beautiful in its audacity. Carol, from her throne on the HOA board, would create the problem. A fine for a dirty driveway, a patch of algae, a stained fence. Then her husband, through his conveniently owned company, would sell the overpriced solution. They weren't just enforcing the rules, they were farming the residents for profit. A cold, hard anger settled deep in Frank's chest. This was beyond a power trip. This was graft. It was a betrayal of every homeowner who paid their dues and trusted the board to act in their best interest. He printed every page of the LLC filing, the printer whirring in the quiet house. He three-hole punched the sheets and added them to the HOA folder. The file was now thick, heavy with the weight of evidence. It was his weapon. But a weapon is useless without the knowledge of how and when to wield it. He now had the what, the who, and the why. What he lacked was the how. He couldn't just stand up in a meeting and start shouting accusations. A man like him, an outsider, accusing the long-standing president of corruption without a perfectly executed plan. They'd dismiss him as a crackpot, a disgruntled homeowner with a grudge. She would twist it, claim he was slandering her, and might even threaten legal action herself. He was a master of mechanics and logistics, not torts and bylaws. He needed legal expertise. He needed an ordnance specialist who knew how to handle explosive material. The next morning, he found Jenna again, this time weeding her petunias. "Jenna, you said your husband was a paralegal," he began, getting straight to the point. "You seem to know your way around the bylaws, but this is bigger than I thought. Is there a lawyer in the neighborhood? Someone who understands HOA law and isn't a friend of Carol's?" Jenna stood up, wiping her hands on her jeans, her expression turning serious. "You found something, didn't you?" "I found the machine's master gear," Frank said, "and it's broken." Jenna thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the quiet street as if searching for an answer. "Go see Arthur Vance," she said finally, her voice low. 21 Elderberry Court. He's a retired corporate lawyer, a real curmudgeon. He was on the original development board that helped write the first draft of our CC&Rs 30 years ago. He hates what Carol's turned the board into, but he says he's too old to fight. But if you've got real evidence, Arthur loves a good fight more than he loves to complain about having nothing to fight about. Frank found 21 Elderberry Court to be a stately brick house, shaded by a massive ancient oak tree. He rang the bell, and the door was opened by a man who looked exactly as Jenna had described. Arthur Vance was tall and thin, with a shock of white hair and eyebrows that seemed permanently fixed in a skeptical arch. "Yes?" Arthur asked, his voice a dry rasp. "Mr. Vance, my name is Frank Miller. Jenna Davis suggested I speak with you." "Did she now?" Arthur grumbled. "I suppose you have a complaint about the color of your neighbor's mailbox?" "No, sir," Frank said. "I have a problem with systemic corruption, breach of fiduciary duty, and racketeering. May I have a few minutes of your time?" The sharp legal terms, coming from a man who looked more like a mechanic than a litigator, made Arthur's eyebrows twitch with interest. He hesitated, then swung the door open. "You've got 5 minutes. Don't waste them." The inside of the house smelled of old books, leather, and pipe tobacco. Frank was led into a study where every wall was lined with law books. Arthur sat behind a large mahogany desk, gesturing for Frank to take the worn leather chair opposite him. Frank didn't waste time with small talk. He placed his HOA folder on the polished desk. "I'd like to present my findings," he said, his voice falling into the familiar cadence of a military briefing. He laid it all out, piece by piece. The initial fine, the inspection report proving the stain was pre-existing, the dismissed appeal, the notes from the Facebook group, the budget analysis with the payments to Clean Slate circled in red. And for the finale, he placed the printout of the LLC registration on top of the pile. Arthur listened in silence, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He picked up the LLC filing, his long, bony fingers tracing the names. He put on a pair of reading glasses and read it again. A long, slow silence filled the room. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. Finally, Arthur Vance took off his glasses and looked at Frank. The grumpy, skeptical facade had dissolved, replaced by a predatory gleam, the look of a sleeping lion that had just scented prey on the wind. "Son," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "What you have here isn't just a bylaw violation. This is a classic textbook case of self-dealing and a flagrant breach of fiduciary duty. She didn't just bend the rules, she shattered them for personal profit." He tapped the LLC document with a decisive finger. "This is the smoking gun, and you've got her dead to rights." A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. "Now," Arthur said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a newfound fire, "let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about how we're going to dismantle her little empire, piece by piece, entirely by the book." The soldier had found his general. The counter-offensive was about to begin. Arthur Vance's study, once a place of quiet retirement, now hummed with the energy of a military command post. The mahogany desk was the battlefield map. The HOA folder was the intelligence dossier. Arthur, the seasoned general, and Frank, the field commander, plotted their final assault. "We don't ambush her," Arthur said, pacing slowly in front of his bookshelves. "Ambushes are messy. They create sympathy for the target. This needs to be a public execution, done with surgical precision, completely under the sanction of the rules she claims to love." The plan was simple, elegant, and ruthless. Frank would formally request a spot on the agenda for the quarterly HOA meeting in 2 weeks, under the guise of a final appeal regarding fine on Lot 42. It was the bait. Carol, seeing only the lone homeowner she had already defeated twice, would walk into the trap with all the arrogance of a predator who doesn't realize it's being hunted. "You will begin with your personal grievance," Arthur instructed, pointing a long finger at Frank. "Be calm. Be factual. Let her dismiss you. Let her look smug. When she tries to shut you down, that's your pivot point. You broaden the scope from your stain to a community pattern. That's when you turn on the projector." Frank had purchased a small, powerful Pico projector, the kind a traveling salesman might use. It was his piece of modern artillery. Then, Arthur continued, his eyes gleaming. While they're reeling from the financial data, you deliver the kill shot, the LLC document. In that moment of shocked silence, I will stand up, not as your lawyer, but as a concerned resident and co-author of the bylaws, and I will legally and publicly fillet her. The 2 weeks leading up to the meeting were tense with anticipation. Frank practiced his presentation in the garage, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. He timed his speech, polished his slides, and memorized the key figures. Meanwhile, Jenna worked her own quiet magic. On the Liberty Hills Uncensored Facebook group, she didn't reveal the plan, but she stoked the fires of curiosity. "Anyone else tired of how things are run?" she posted. "I hear Frank Miller from Poplar Lane is going to make a final stand at the quarterly meeting. Might be interesting to see." It was just enough to ensure the meeting would be unusually well attended. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. The air was stuffy, smelling of stale coffee and simmering resentment. More than 50 residents sat on uncomfortable folding chairs under the flat, humming fluorescent lights. Triple the usual turnout. At the head table, Carol Petty sat flanked by her silent, compliant board members. She surveyed the crowd, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes at the unusually large audience, but her expression quickly settled back into one of smug command. She ran the meeting with her usual iron-fisted efficiency, dispensing with the treasurer's report and landscaping update with brisk impatience. Then came the moment. "Item number 5, she announced, a hint of disdain in her voice. "A final appeal from Mr. Frank Miller, 42 Poplar Lane. Mr. Miller, you have 3 minutes." Frank walked to the front of the room, carrying a small laptop and his projector. He placed them on a small table and faced the board. He was calm, his posture erect. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Frank Miller. I'm here tonight because I was fined $200 for an oil stain that my own inspection report proves was on my driveway before I purchased my home." He held up the report. "I presented this evidence to Mrs. Petty. I presented it in writing to the board. It was dismissed without consideration." Carol sighed theatrically. "Mr. Miller, as you have been told multiple times, this matter is closed. The bylaws are clear. We are not relitigating this. Your 3 minutes are nearly up." "You're right," Frank said, looking directly at her. "The matter of my driveway is closed." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "But the matter of how this board, under your leadership, conducts its business is now open for discussion." He clicked a button on his laptop. The projector whirred to life, throwing a bright, clear image onto the portable screen he had set up. On it was a list of names, lots, and fines. "The Hendersons basketball hoop, $100. Mr. Gable's garden gnome, $75. The Watsons inappropriate siding algae, $150. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. People were looking at each other, nodding. These weren't just stories on Facebook anymore. They were data. "You're out of order," Carol snapped, her face beginning to flush. Frank ignored her, clicking to the next slide. It was a pie chart from the HOA budget, showing a shockingly large slice labeled Mandated Property Remediation. The vendor name was listed below, Clean Slate Services. "Over the last 2 years," Frank said, his voice like steel, "our HOA has directed over $28,000 in work to one and only one preferred contractor. The murmuring grew louder. Carol was banging her gavel now, her composure shattering. "This is a private financial matter. You are slandering this board." "It's not slander if it's true," Frank said, his voice cutting through the noise. He clicked to the final, devastating slide. It was the State Registration for Clean Slate Services, LLC. The name and address of the managing member were highlighted in a stark yellow box. Robert Petty, 18 Primrose Path. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A dead, profound silence followed. You could hear Carol's ragged breathing. Her face had gone from red to a ghostly white. Before she could form a word, a calm, authoritative voice rose from the audience. Arthur Vance stood up, tall and imposing. "As one of the original drafters of our governing documents," Arthur began, his voice resonating with power, "I feel compelled to speak. Article 4, Section B of our bylaws, which I personally helped write, strictly and unequivocally prohibits any board member from using their position for personal financial gain or engaging in acts of self-dealing." He looked directly at the pale, trembling Carol. What Mr. Miller has so bravely and meticulously presented tonight is not just a simple violation of that rule. It is a profound, calculated, and sustained breach of fiduciary duty. You have not been protecting our investments, Mrs. Petty. You have been lining your own pockets with them. Chaos erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing fingers. One of the board members, a man who saw his own reputation circling the drain, stood up shakily. I move for a vote of no confidence in the president." "Seconded," roared a voice from the back. A show of hands was called. A forest of arms shot up. It was nearly unanimous. In the space of 10 minutes, Carol Petty's reign was over. She grabbed her purse and fled the room without another word. The investigation didn't stop at the HOA meeting. With Arthur Vance's legal connections and a growing coalition of outraged residents, Frank filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Within 2 months, the Pettys were under investigation for fraud and self-dealing. Charges followed. Carol's smug face was replaced with a mugshot on the local news. Robert's clean slate business was shuttered, assets frozen, and restitution ordered. The judge didn't mince words. "You used the law as a weapon for profit. Now the law is your sentence." The new HOA board, with Arthur as interim president and Jenna as secretary, rewrote the bylaws with the community in open meetings. Transparency replaced secrecy, and every decision was voted on. No more rule by decree. At the year-end community gathering, Frank stood before a modest crowd in the newly reopened clubhouse, now repainted and bearing a plaque. Dedicated to those who serve in uniform and in principle. Jenna raised a toast to Frank Miller for showing us that retirement doesn't mean standing down. Laughter and applause broke out. Children played tag across the green. Neighbors swapped homemade recipes, and someone even brought back Mr. Gable's infamous garden gnome, now proudly displayed by the clubhouse door. Frank stood back, a paper plate of ribs in one hand, and looked at the scene. No flags were lowered, no sirens blared. But in that moment, he felt the kind of peace he hadn't known since Martha passed. Not the silence of absence, but the warmth of belonging. And for the first time in years, he wasn't just maintaining order. He was part of something worth preserving.